Today we're at Ironbridge, deep in the heart of Shropshire, and we're going to visit the Museum of Iron and Enginuity. They're right next to each other on the grounds of the Coalbrookdale Company, founded by Abraham Darby. So here we have, before you go into the museum itself, this bit's actually free. There's an original blast furnace under this kind of steel tent. It's on the grounds. You can see how an original blast furnace would have worked. And effectively, the process was invented by Abraham Darby, or perfected, to work with coal, so not needing to use coke, which is kind of cooked coal. And you can go inside, you can walk around and through the furnace and see exactly how it works. There's a river which you can kind of hear it thundering away, but you can't see it. This was a wheel turned by the water, and that wheel turned a series of rods which opened and closed a bellows because you need a constant flow of air, and really on this scale a manual one wouldn't really work, but that's long gone. Over here you can see where there was a steam engine to achieve the same effect, and actually behind this fence there you can see the wall facing towards us between the railway arches. That's where the steam engine was. Underneath it you've got a bricked arch roof, and underneath that is the river flowing through here. This all dates back, the railway viaducts later, but all the brickwork from the furnace itself dates back to about 1700s. Could just as easily be the 1950s. On the way inside the furnace, there's a sign saying the birthplace of industry. And in many ways, if you had to name a single spot where the Industrial Revolution began, if you're thinking iron, it's here. It's this rather unassuming furnace. Inside is a kind of bottle-shaped kiln. And there's a ramp through there so they can go down the tunnel and they can load. There's a top loading for pouring in the various materials, and effectively they had to put in the mixture of iron ore, coal, and lime. As it melts and falls down through the furnace, the lime takes the carbon dioxide that's released from the burning, comes with the lime, and it forms slag. And slag is kind of spooned off at the back there, and you can see the furnace face just round here, which was put in by Abraham Darby the First in 1638. This was built, so actually before Abraham Darby's time. Abraham Darby started in about 1710. And originally this would have been with coke. And coke, because you had to process the coal before you could use it, it made it more time consuming, and the way it burnt, you didn't get the same level of production. So it's much cheaper and more industrial when you put coal in. And this is the spot where they worked out how to do that. And you can see the tunnels underneath the loading ramp. So they could come in and they could take slag out, they could take the metal out, and that would get poured. And it was industry on a very large scale, but really here was where it became properly industrial, and we had a series of these, and the Coalbrookdale Company owned this whole stretch of this side valley down to the river. There was no town of Ironbridge back then, so it was simply a case of choosing a place near a river that was also near to iron deposits, coal, had some water for power. And this is where they built it, and everything really came off from that. Hopefully you'll watch the video about the Ironbridge itself, which is a real marvel. But that couldn't have been achieved without this industrial innovation. And this is where they loaded the materials. So literally there was a ramp up here, and when they got to the top, they tip it in probably like in a wheelbarrow. And that allowed them to load vast quantities and manage the uh, impurities coming off at the mid-level. But it's lovely that you can walk all around it and kind of see it as living piece of history. It might seem boring making iron, and it's all very common today, but this did revolutionize society. And hopefully in the Museum of Iron we'll see some of the products they produced, and you'll see how it moved forward under the Derbies in particular. And there's some other kilns over here which are furnaces which are less well preserved. There's also, we'll throw in Bedlam at the end of the video, which, although it's not strictly close, it's probably one of the main furnaces at the time, and it's the one that's very famous from the painting you can see in the Science Museum of Bedlam Furnace. It's near the bridge. Now, walking through the car park, the Museum of Iron's at the end. There's a library and a place you can get snacks on the left there. Unfortunately, it was all covered with scaffolding when I visited, but it is a beautiful building itself and very covered in iron detailing, as you can expect from what was a very wealthy company by then. And this is actually a furnace from about 400 years earlier. The museum tour starts up on the top floor and then works its way down to the ground floor. Must admit, I quite like them starting at the top, so you're walking down the stairs. That explains the blast furnace and why that was revolutionary. Has some interesting pieces of ironwork from the metal on that flintlock pistol. There's a back for a fire, a cannon, and a cannonball. And when you're primarily using iron for cannonballs, you don't need to be particularly precise. It just needs to be a lump of metal in the right sort of shape. And it needs to be moderately cheap, but military can always afford a bit more. When you start using it for things like the flintlock, it really needs to be high quality and consistent. And really, industrialization was important for some of those later uses of iron. And there's a whole collection here of different items from different periods, from Roman nails and horseshoes from probably a couple of 100 years before. And they show the Roman, because the Romans bought iron foundries to Britain, and then it works through the Middle Ages, the monks, through to kind of Stuarts, and then the Revolution with the Derbies. And there's a nice timeline on the wall which really explains the history of the area and what happened with iron, when key people were born, and what they achieved with it, and other events tied around that. That's Build Wasabi there, which we'll be visiting on one of our Saturday Unbound histories soon. Really, there's a slow culmination towards the launch of the Industrial Revolution with these remarkable changes in steel manufacturing. And because the Colebrook Company was at the heart of this, you really see some of their achievements. Look at the quality of this now, and then wait until we get to the display floor and you see what a quantum leap it is to the iron of just a generation later. This is a bellows from an old foundry. it's important that you push air through because oxygen is needed for the fire. You need to maintain the temperature. Same way as if you have a burn barrel, you need a hole near the bottom for the air to come in. There's a lovely model here that explains how blast furnace works. And that comes back to the one we saw outside where I was saying that there was a water wheel. And the water wheel basically pumps the bellows and helps maintain that temperature. The material melts on the way down and then comes pouring out the side. And here's an example of one of the pots that Abraham Darby made. And if I lower the camera, which hopefully I do, it's very nice quality and much higher quality than the previous, which was much more like pig iron, which is the sort of first rough iron. And it's not wrought, it hasn't received the pressing and hammering that really strengthens iron. And it also hasn't had the same level of bonding of carbon into the metal, because the metal piece I pointed out a moment ago, you can see it's very rough and bobbled and poor quality on the outside, whereas soon it's perfectly polished and firm and clean and strong. And actually, when they look at the quality of the iron from this era, it was pretty much the quality that we're producing 200 years later. Some quotes and explanations. An explanation of the whole cast iron problem where they're using charcoal and then coke, and really they want to move towards coal because coal's going to make it much cheaper. However, it's just doesn't work. And it took quite a while to figure out how to do it. And they baked the coal and used the coke to actually make the iron, or to melt the iron. There's an explanation of Darby II. Abraham Darby II is often forgotten because you have Abraham Darby the Older, who founded the iron foundry here, and you have Abraham Darby III, who continued the legacy with the Ironbridge. Often the second's a bit overlooked. And they were Quakers, so they had a very strong work ethic, didn't believe in war and violence. So when they built the bridge, they specifically charged soldiers, whether they were on duty or off duty, the same amount of money as everyone else. And that's because as Quakers, they didn't approve of violence and military actions. Really, they just worked hard and made a lot of money. Then there's an explanation of the bridge, and that's one of the pieces from the bridge. It's quite easy to underestimate the importance of the bridge because it was an icon of its time. It showed what could be achieved with iron. It showed that iron was versatile. It also showed the elegance of the bridge. It was very light because it was so strong. It was much smaller than you would have with a wooden bridge, but at the same time stronger. And they cover a lot of the different things that were achieved once they had this going. Wilkinson, Richard Reynolds, different people who ran foundries and had a very large impact on the iron industry. I believe Reynolds and the Darbys were in business together at one point. He built the first iron aqueduct, and I believe he built Pontyclyde. If you get a chance to see the Pontyclyde, really beautiful outside of Llangollen. They have some interesting old pieces, like this was cast by Abraham Darby himself. It's the second, again, the one we always overlook. Really a remarkable family. This is the Hayes Incline, which is near the Coalport factory and the Blitz Hill Victorian town. A remarkable piece of engineering to lift canal barges between canals on different levels. And then there's an explanation of the evolution of making iron. They started to use iron for more and more applications, and as I've said before, the bridge really showed how powerful it was. And it became a really driving industry in Britain. And another one that comes out, they say tourists are spies there, is Prussia. Prussia basically was the kingdom of iron, founded on the iron industry. And a lot of its wealth came from that. It was only really with the Second World War that they lost dominance of Germany when they were banned as a state. And here there's a beautiful model of the bridge made in mahogany. It's very detailed. Gives you a really good idea. I probably should have included that when I talked about the bridge. And the gorge itself is actually moving about, I think it's about a metre a decade. But the bridge is fine, but it's the stonework heading up to the bridge which has had to be substantially remodelled and protected because the two sides of the valley are crushing in on the bridge. Here's a really large pot. It's sometimes called a missionary pot. It was used for melting blubber on whaling ships. Here's a hammer. And a ship's anchor actually found inside the River Severn. But an impressive piece of work. You could see why a good quality anchor would be important and also worth a lot of money. Here another timeline. Very good on timelines and the explanations. If you take the time to settle them and follow it, then it's very instructive, but not boring. And that's Trevethick. If you watch my video on the Bliss Hill Victorian town, they had one of Trevethic's steam trains. And they were much earlier than Stevenson, but they didn't pull passengers, they pulled cargo. If you see the video on the Science Museum in London, we actually see Trevethic's Puffing Billy, which is like a larger version of that train. And because of the work that the Abraham Darbys did, Coalbrookdale was at the centre a lot of this innovation, and also there was a lot of technical improvements. And when you go down to the next floor, you really see what they achieved. Here, beautiful. If you compare that to the anchor, okay, it's a different type of item, but the elegance and the quality of that iron is a world away from the iron of some of the earlier pieces we saw. And this isn't within a lifetime, this is within 20 or 30 years. It went from the quality they'd had for hundreds of years and it improved to almost what we have today. And there's a good explanation of the Ironbridge itself. It was erected by the Coalbrookdale Company, who really were expanding and becoming a powerhouse in this area. And you're just around a corner from the bridge, so it's about 5 minutes drive away, and you get parking for 40 minutes quite near the bridge, so you can stop and have a little look at the bridge on the way out. An explanation of the conservation work that's been carried out. A load of pictures of the bridge. Slightly out of the rest of the museum, the Shropshire Giant. He was he worked in a foundry, and basically because he was in iron, they've got his work here. That was his stool. He was a very large, very strong man who worked in a foundry for a few decades and then retired as basically a travelling character in a circus because he was extremely large and extremely strong as well. And they've got these quaint little pieces preserved here. That was his walking stick. So it wasn't particularly tall, it was just very wide and stocky, I think is the polite word. Then we're going through to later works where Coalbrookdale Company was producing high quality pieces of iron, like these two dogs and this gorgeous table for a hunting lodge. The whole table is made out of iron. And then you've got the lamp post, the post box, the water pump in the right. You could see the quality as we're heading through to the late 1800s, well, probably 1850s through 1890s, where there was really beautiful, high quality steel. And it was being used in a way it hadn't been before as well, with machinery here and a lot of samples of how they molded these. So you have the molds and the different pieces. See how they've screwed it together. Grecian vase for your garden. And background's a picture of the 1851 Great Exhibition, which it was the brainchild, or certainly took the credit for it, of the Prince Consort Albert. And the idea was a shop front to the world to show what Britain was doing in industry. And here's some of the pieces that were displayed at the Great Exhibition. Next week we'll be going to Jackfield Tile Museum, and they have some good material on the actual stands that Jackfield had there as well. Here's some coat hangers and ironwork for the house, door stops. Really beautiful pieces, just a world away from what we saw just a few minutes ago. And they have a catalogue, and you can look through the catalogue, and there's different types of ironwork. So these are what Coalbrookdale was offering in 1850. And there's dozens of different grates for fires, fire surrounds, fire backs. You can see things for the garden, things for the house. And nothing had one of them. There was dozens of them. It was like going to IKEA and picking your furniture. You can see there for hallways. There's not one type. There's 20 or 30 garden benches. Different ovens. And the catalogue really had all these details. Lamp posts. Again, dozens of different styles, balustrades for staircases and balconies. And it was the creative use of iron that really made Coalbrook Company a world power in iron, or a world leader. Really, I'd say Abraham Darby, first, second and third, were kind of like the Wedgwoods of the iron industry, and probably a bit more forgotten because the Coalbrookdale Company is long gone. Just round the corner from the Museum of Iron is Enginuity, which doesn't really have a tagline as such. It's effectively engineering and innovation in products, but it's more the engineering use and the engine use of steel. We have this pillar drill, not a world away from one you might see in a workshop today, along with this small train. Here they have a blast furnace. It's interactive. You go inside by walking on the spots on the ground. You load the various materials to make the recipe for cast iron, and then it makes cast iron. Kids love it. This is very much more a kids' museum. You have some interesting samples of cast iron. Like this is a 2,000 litre jug. An explanation of the geology, how it was formed in this area, and how that helped in terms of the coal and the iron. And limestone as well, you need all of those. But it's very much aimed at a younger audience and very much hands-on, interactive. You pretty much touch everything, hence the cages around the big steam engines. Most of it, well, half of it's working, let's say, and half of it is static. Here you have a beautiful example of a beam steam engine. An explanation of a flywheel here. I tried to interact with it and it didn't really give me what the description said. This is a very interesting one, this train here. You can turn the wheel and it actually moves the train. And it's because it's translating your power to not turn the wheel too hard, but it translates into small amounts of movement. And these gears here help to pull it, and you can actually see the train moving, but you might need to stand still for a minute. It's not very fast. Maybe I just didn't spin it fast enough. And here's an explanation of the lever frame tire, which I've got to say had no explanation, but the kids love it. Here's a windmill, some other uses of engineering, manufacturing. This lovely Teddy's fire engine, and a pianola, so it plays itself. A lot of eclectic, I often call it in these videos, eclectic collection of engineering. Here's an explanation of dams and hydropower. So you want to keep enough water in a canal that it's usable. You want enough water flowing down that it produces electricity, and it's striking the balance between all of those. If you allow one dam to hold back the water too much, the dam below doesn't get any water to produce energy. But it's a fun, interactive demonstration of hydrodynamics, and there's Archimedes screw that you can play with. Probably most kids are just playing with it and thinking, isn't this cool? But there is some actual learning in it. Steam engine again. I'd say if you are bringing someone under 15, it's probably very good to come in here. If you're an adult without any children coming, I'd probably skip this museum in favour of others, because I think you won't be learning stuff you don't already know. I'd say if you're an adult without children, it's probably best to go to Blitz Hill and the Museum of Iron. That gets you that everything after that is free if you buy the ticket. In which case, I'd probably recommend the Jackfield Tile Museum and Coalport. If you bring in children, they'll enjoy this a lot more than the Iron Museum. An explanation of food, different types of iron and materials. And up on this platform, you got this exhibition here of the stars, and it basically is that iron comes from the stars. So there's iron in the sun, there's iron everywhere in different quantities, there's some inside every human. And there's some beautiful pictures of supernovae and nebula and stars. Not quite sure how it's. I like this museum, but it feels like it's not thorough enough to earn its rent. Maybe I'm a bit harsh, but it's not changed very much since I was here. Well, so many years ago. Here's the Sandringham steam pumping engine. This was to pump water at Sandringham for the royal family, and it was donated by the Duke of Edinburgh to this museum because it wasn't used anymore. They got electricity there, but it was in use right through till about the 1940s, so just before the war it stopped being used. It's quite a large museum. They have a very large space at the back, which isn't really used. There was, it was half term, so there was a children's interactive session going on there, and there's a fairly large room at the back, but really the main museum is this one room. There's some explanation of different types of food. Largely how different weights take up different amounts of space, which I kind of figured out before I visited the museum. It's good, but I'd say my least favourite are the museums in Ironbridge, because I think it could have done more on the engineering front. Didn't quite find its place for me, but there's some very interesting steam engines and exhibits here. There's an interesting piece here I enjoy. It's a milled steel. It's a bowl, but inside it is effectively a topographical map, and it's quite striking and beautiful, and different steam engines and engines. Here's some old cars. It's a steam powered car and a mini. It's surprising how many museums have a mini cut in half. There's one in the Science Museum in London. I feel like Mini probably gave away cut in half cars to museums as a marketing piece. I still remember some friends who drove minis. Here's the Sinclair C5. He came up with the ZX Spectrum and the 48 and the 81, and he, with groundbreaking for their time. But the C5, the idea was an electric car that you could drive 20 miles and could do about 5 miles an hour, and it was the future of transportation, and it didn't quite work out. I remember thinking it was a bit odd, rather expensive it felt. Here's a model of the SS Great Britain. Isabel Kingdom Brunel, he built a railway from Paddington to Bristol, and then a steam powered boat from there. And as promised, as a bonus while we're on the iron topic, this is the Bedlam furnaces, which were the most famous of the furnaces at one point, and it's the one that's made famous by the painting of Bedlam furnaces at night, and it's right next to the River Severn, just south of the Iron Bridge itself. Sadly, not really much left to see, but it's a nice little stop off on the way to the other museums. I say make sure you subscribe. Come back next week and we'll be visiting the pottery museums in the valley.